Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to our Tuesday seminar today. Our seminar today is, the theme of our seminar is Prospects for Post-COVID Recovery in Latin America. Last year, we designated a few themes. COVID was so dominant in the region that we had some panels dedicated to the issue. And this year, Dr. Klass is optimistic and has dedicated a series of panels to paths to recovery. This will be the first in that series. We have an incredibly distinguished panel to speak to us today on this topic. I am thrilled. I'm Fran Hagopian, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this session. I want to just first mention a few housekeeping details before we go on. First of all, I co-moderate this entire series with my colleague Alicia Holland, who many of you will remember who are regulars of the Tuesday seminars, the brilliant person who asks the brilliant questions. She is on leave this year, and she may make an appearance later in the semester because she's kind of hard to repress, but we've been trying to tell her to be on leave. She won't be with us today, but I am joined by my colleague of many decades and the director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, my colleague in the government department, Steve Levitsky. Steve, you want to say hi to everybody?
And decidedly less brilliant. Hi, everybody.
Well, we all are, so what can we say? But the panelists are brilliant too, so we're all set today. Just to, first of all, acknowledge the three people without whom these sessions would not be possible. Gabby Patterson is the person who pulls these seminars together and who pushes all the buttons to make sure that everyone is heard, who should be, who's not heard, who shouldn't be, and that you're seeing the right images. Jillian Scales is our director of events at Dr. Klass, and spectacular at what she does. And the person who has really organized this entire series for us, our assistant director at Dr. Klass, is Paulo Ibarra. And without Paula, we wouldn't have this series. So I am deeply grateful to all of them for their work in making us, putting us up front and making us look good. We have a series of events at Dr. Klass. You can see this event. This event will be available it's being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel after the event. And I think Gabby will now drop something into the chat. And you can also join the Dr. Klass email list. So have a look at the chat. We would love to hear your questions. Our panelists will speak each for about 12 to 15 minutes in order to allow time for those questions, but we'll ask them for you. If you put them in the question and answer function, the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom bar. So Steve and I will monitor those questions, and you can put them in at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. If a question occurs to you while someone's speaking, please put it in there. So the last thing I want to do before I stop talking is introduce these panelists. It would take me 15 minutes to do justice to just how lucky we are to have them here. So with my apologies to them for going over their amazing credentials a little bit quickly. Our first speaker will be Adriana Camacho. Adriana joins us from the Universidad de los Andes, as well as the United Nations Development Program. Adriana is a PhD in economics from Brown University in 2007. She is an associate professor at the Universidad de los Andes. She is an academic advisor for several projects at CAF, at the Indian Development Corporation. She has served as in the Colombian government as the director of monitoring and evaluation of public policies at the Department of Planning. And she has been everywhere from Berlin to the World Bank. She's edited journals. Again, I can't go through all of it. I can tell you that her research has been published in all the best places, including Lancet. I'm always jealous when I see someone who's published in Lancet. And she's going to share with us some work from the UN Development Program, where she's also got a project running. After Adriana will be Jose Scheinkman. Jose is the Charles and Lynn Jean Professor of Economics at Columbia. Columbia was fortunate enough to steal him from Chicago, where he trained a generation of all my Brazilian friends who are economists, as well as my colleague Ed Glazer. So he has trained a generation of people who work on the economics of Brazil and the economics of Latin America. He is a member of every learned society on the globe, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, fellows of econometric societies. He's won Guggenheims. He has won honorary degrees from French universities. He's a real big deal, and we're really lucky to have him here today. And our final panelist will be Santiago Levy, who is also an economist, and he is currently non-resident senior fellow with the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings, and he's president of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association. Santiago, I have known for decades, since we were graduate students in Cambridge at roughly the same time. And Santiago, I became a professor. Santiago was a professor for a while and then decided to solve poverty in the world. Santiago, of all the things that we see on his bio, what's not here is that he was the author of essentially the first iteration of the Mexican conditional cash transfer programs that did so much around the world to alleviate poverty. If he did nothing else in his life, that would have been an accomplishment enough. But I couldn't begin to cite all the prizes he's won for all the papers that he's published. He has worked for all the departments of government that he's worked in. He has published 6 books, 24 articles in peer-reviewed journals, 20 book chapters on economic growth, productivity, social policy, informality, education, budgetary, tax policy. I could go on. So not only do we have 3 of Latin America's largest experts from 3 of Latin America's largest countries represented here, but we have the range of topics that will be necessary for us all to understand and draw from so that we can understand Latin America's path to recovery after COVID. And so with that, I will turn the mic over to Adriana. And Adriana, please.
Thanks so much, Fran. I'm going to share the presentation that I have here. First of all, thanks so much to Fran and to the Rockefeller Center for this invitation. And it's a pleasure to join the panel with Santiago and Jose. And it's going to be great. So here, oh, wait a second now, I'll put it in a bigger screen. That's it. Can you see it right? Yep, good. Okay, so we're going to talk about the prospects for economic recovery in Latin America post-COVID. And this is going to be based on a joint project that we have with the World Bank and UNDP right now. The project is called the World Bank and the UNDP LAC High Frequency Phone Service. And the World Bank did the first round of service in 2020. It had 3 waves and 13 countries. And recently in 2021, we joined the project with the UNDP, and we are doing 2 waves of service for 22 countries. The data that we just got is from May and June of this year, and we're going to be running the second round of surveys in September and October. So I'm going to show you some data which is really preliminary, but that give us some thoughts about what's going on, what happened during the pandemic and what's going on right now. The list of countries that we have included in our sample are listed here. The blue ones are the countries that entered in the round of 2021. So we have like a good number of countries that were not surveyed before and that come from the Caribbean. These are 22 countries, and the data I'm going to show you has preliminary data of 17 countries. These data follows a random digital data sampling strategy. And the sample includes individuals 18 years or older with cell phones. So some of the highlights of the shocks from the pandemic that I want to show you, I'm going to start by food insecurity. So first, we have a graph where we show the before and after pandemic food insecurity indicator. What we would expect if we were in the same condition is that we would be over the 43-degree line, but we are not. We are all the countries are to the right. That means that we are in a worse condition. We have a higher food insecurity indicator. The orange dot is Latin America. So what we see is that during the pandemic, the food insecurity almost doubled in Latin America, and 28% of households ran out of food due to lack of money or resources. This is the first big highlight in terms of the impact of the pandemic. Some additional correlations that we did with in terms of inequality and food insecurity and poverty. And food insecurity shows that countries with higher inequality and poverty experience the largest increase in food insecurity, as I showed you here in the graph that you see on the right hand side. And these countries have to do a greater, so the message is that these countries have to do a greater effort to recover from the pandemic, those who have more inequality and who have more poverty. Regarding labor markets, so what we see is that the pandemic impacted labor markets in an intensive and extensive margin. So what we see from the data is that 72% of individuals reported that before the pandemic they had a job, the ones that we surveyed, and in the last week they had 62% of them had a job. So there's job loss, as we have seen in many other statistics that have been shown from the pandemic. Regarding informality, and informality understood as contributing to social security, we have that 59% of the individuals surveyed were informal before the pandemic, and now this figure is 65%. And regarding the extensive margin that I was mentioning, the number of hours worked reduced before and after the pandemic. Before we had 43 hours, and now we have 37 hours worked. In terms of the numbers of people that can work remotely, is 25% of the individuals report that they can work remotely. And the main reason for not being able to work remotely is that their job can only be done in person. Okay, this slide is showing some information about the size of the firms. So just to get an idea of where they employed people coming from before the pandemic, this is the distribution of the number of employees by firm. So if you see the first two stacks, you will see 1 worker and 2 to 4 workers. So 47% of employed people were in firms of less than 5 employees. And what we are seeing from the data is that the additional unemployment is generated that was generated by the pandemic is concentrated among the smallest firms. So this is the numbers that will show us this. So the new unemployed that were employed before, or that were employed before pandemic, 53% of them come from smaller firms. But another question that one would raise is now where are the new employees, or how's the composition of firms, of employers that we have in the survey? And this is this number. So 58% of individuals are coming from firms which are less than 5 workers. So what I can see here is kind of a reshuffling between destruction and creation of jobs, but mainly in the smaller firms, in firms that are less than 5 employees, which Santiago can tell us later, how could this be impacting the productivity in the region? Okay, in terms of digital and education, I have some highlights as well. So this is similar to the graph that we were seeing for food insecurity. If we were in the same condition in terms of internet connection, we would be in the 45-degree line. But what we see is that all countries are better off. So this is a comparison between 2019 household surveys with respect to our data for 7 countries that we can do this comparison. And the blue dots are urban areas, and the orange dots are rural areas. So what we can see is that the coverage before pandemic was really, really low. But after pandemic, if we see the average is much, much higher. So that's great news. I think it's not a good, it's a great news. Because we cannot say that everything is really bad. So during the pandemic, internet coverage more than doubled. And another great news is the digital gap between urban and rural areas in 2021 is smaller than in 2019. So this is what this graph is telling us. But the question is, even though we increased in coverage, the question is, are the available digital resources enough for education demands? So internet spending increased in 31% of these households that we surveyed. The main use of internet, and this is very interesting, 57% of the households report that their main use for education, 37% for instant messaging, 32% for social media. Virtual work is like the fourth or fifth main use that they report, with a 25%. Regarding the device availability, the survey asks about the number of devices, and we can do a per capita device. The numbers for that we have are 0.5 computers or tablets per capita and 0.9 devices that can be connected to the internet. This includes a cell phone. So it's just to understand if people could connect for education and for work at home. And lastly, 90% of schools from the people who answer our survey say that they are offering virtual classes. 83% of enrolled students took virtual classes, and 23% attended face-to-face class. As I was telling you, the surveys were collected between May and June of this year. Regarding unpaid care and domestic work, we're really interested in this section regarding topics of gender as well. So what we can see, it's a correlation between the people who lost their jobs or who increased the domestic work with having reported some kind of mental problems. So mental problems, we're just asking whether they have difficulty sleeping, anxiety, nervousness, worry, or just feeling lonely. So what we can get from this graph is that job loss and increase in unpaid work are associated with greater mental health problems, in a weak version of the measure of mental health problems, let's say. Regarding the duties at home or the domestic work, in general, unpaid work and domestic work has increased more for females than for males in the pandemic. So what we can see here in this graph is that the type of domestic work or the unpaid care that we are showing is domestic work, childcare, and education assistance. It's really impressive. First of all, that females are increasing. This is the dark blue is the increase. The next one is just stay the same and very little for decreases. So what we can see is that females are increasing much more their duties at home, and it's incredible the number or the demand, let's say, for educational assistance at home. Not only for females, but for males and females, it's really high, the demand in terms of time that parents have to, or the adults need to do in terms of education assistance. Regarding government transfers and vaccine policies. So 15% of households received government transfers before the pandemic in the region, and 39% during the pandemic. So there was an important increase in terms of the transfers of the government. During the pandemic, 25% of households received transfers that were usual programs, and 24% from new programs. So there was not also an expansion in terms of coverage, but of new programs that were created. And mobile wallets have become increasingly important to reach individuals with less access to traditional banking services. I think we need to explore this more, and when the data is released and openly, so maybe we could have more information on this related to prospects of vaccination in Latin America. So what we see from the surveys is that 84% of unvaccinated people in LAC plan to get vaccinated in the future. But from the ones who are unvaccinated, 56% state that the reason for not wanting to get vaccinated is the lack of trust on the vaccine or its effectiveness. And just to do a scope in Colombia, which is my country, and on the topics that I work the most, which are topics in terms of poverty. So I'm just going to show you that the numbers and the impact that had the pandemic here. So the monetary and multidimensional poverty in Colombia increased between 2019 and 2020. So the poverty increased from 35.7% to 42.5%. This implies that we have 3.5 million new poor out of the 21 million poor in Colombia. Our population is 50 million people. And in terms of multidimensional poverty, we increased from 17.5% to 18.1%. And the three indicators that are mostly affected were the households with no attendance to school, that went from 25% to 16.4%. It's even weaker for rural areas than urban areas. And the other two indicators that got that were strongly affected by the pandemic were formal work and long-term unemployment. So in terms of the government transfers to mitigate the effect of the pandemic, we had several ones and additional ones as I showed you in the previous slide for the region. And here were the ingreso solidario, extraordinary CCT transfers, returns of the value-added tax, and support for formal employment. The government transfers coverage increased from 4 million people, the 4 million households they were reaching before the pandemic, to 7 million households. But this unexpected spending that relied on the social protection system to reach the most vulnerable opened like a fiscal hole, let's say, and now there's a need of a reform to reduce this fiscal deficit. And one last point that I want to mention in terms of what I think that happened in Colombia is that urban areas were the most affected by the pandemic. The transfers were small in the urban areas relative to the prices that they have for larger cities, and the unemployment hit them harder. So I think that in rural areas it was less of a shock in terms of employment, in terms of income, than what we saw in the urban areas. And I think that's my presentation. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. You've given us a wonderful start, Adriana. We're very grateful to you. Thank you. So next we'll have Jose.
Hi. Well, first of all, I want to thank Fran and her colleagues for the invitation. Fran, you did an over-the-top introduction, but you forgot a very important point. Between Chicago and Columbia, I was for 13 years at Princeton, where I had many bright students. I taught, and one of them was Alicia Holland. And I was also Glenn Wiles, Alicia's husband, advisor. So anyway, so I'm always happy to know that Alicia is doing remarkably well. So, you know, often Latin American economies share serious long-term problems, you know, our remarkable inequality, the low level of education, governments that, although capturing a sizable share of GDP in some countries as taxes, are incapable of delivering basic service to its citizens. So those are common characteristics in Latin America that affected the performance during the pandemic and post-pandemic. It will affect post-pandemic. It's also true that in the aftermath of the pandemic, we have some trends that should help many Latin American economies. One is growing commodity prices. This is an example, one of them. And another is the understanding that the production chains have become too dependent on a few Asian economies. And that should encourage investments elsewhere. So Latin America is one of the places where some of those investments will come. Nonetheless, the prospect for each Latin American economy, at least in the relatively short run, is highly dependent on local conditions, the goals and the capacities of the particular governments and of entrepreneurs to structure necessary responses to this crisis. For this reason, I'm going to concentrate my remarks on Brazil, a country I follow closely, and which I think is in some sense an extreme case. Okay. So let's start with the opportunities. Brazil is a very efficient food and hard commodity producer, both oil and iron ore, etc., and produces also steel and so on, a lot of industrialized commodities. And they should benefit from the high commodity prices. This high commodity prices are being caused mostly because of need to rebuild a lot of stuff that was not done during the pandemic. Brazil is currently not a major participant in global production chains, but they could benefit from the broadening of these production chains. If we had a better tax system, we had improvements in infrastructure, less protectionism, okay, that would help us in that direction. Brazil is also particularly Latin America that has a group of world-class entrepreneurs, that could help Brazil participate in this global supply chain. Nonetheless, and by the way, I don't make economic predictions. I read the consensus and repeat them. That's not my game. But if you look the predictions until 2023, is for the rest of this year, for 2022, they're very somber. Okay, GDP contracted 4.1% in 2020, and the consensus forecast is that Brazil should grow something like 5% in 2021 and less than 2% in 2022. If these predictions are realized, the average growth rate of the Bolsonaro government will be 1% a year. Now, population still grows about 80, what we economists call 80 basis points, which is 0.8%. So essentially, income would be stationary for this 4 years, after 4 years. Now, on top of that, we have a predicted inflation for 2021 of 7.5%. The 10-year interest rate, which is a form of long-term interest rate very used in Brazil, exceeds 11% a year, and current unemployment rate is 14%. So there is a sense in which investors and the market are kind of very pessimistic about the economy. All these numbers are obtained, some of them are measured, like the unemployment, the other are obtained from surveys that the Brazilian Central Bank runs and asking investors and what are their predictions for the market. So those are averages I gave you. Now, what's the reason for this very pessimistic outlook? Okay, I think it's obvious. Okay, Bolsonaro, who is our current president, has the worst instinct concerning climate, health, economic, and educational policies. So everything that we need to do, we have a president that has the worst instincts about it. So let me start with climate. Bolsonaro's action on climate is costing the country an increase in the cost of external capital. Okay, maybe I can talk more about this. I think that's a huge issue for Brazil, but in this introduction, I don't have that much time. Okay, on top of that, there is evidence that the destruction of the forest that Bolsonaro government is not only tolerating but promoting is going to have negative consequences for the production in the Cerrado, which is like the engine of Brazilians' agriculture. So let's go to health. Although Brazil has traditionally a first-rate immunization program that was built through the years, and on top of that, we have very few of those crazy anti-vaxxers compared to the US. By the way, Adriana's data show, how I understood, showed that that's also a Latin American characteristic, well to US, who have less anti-vaxxers. There were substantial delays on the purchase of vaccines, and that, of course, delayed the immunization process. So right now, it's always hard to measure. There's several ways of measuring this number, but in the quote relevant population, the completely vaccinated is around 30%. Although a larger fraction of the relevant population than in the US has received the first dose. So there's a lot of people who are trying to get it, but this program is often interrupted. Another problem I see here is that, as far as I know, and as far as the press has been able to find, there are no vaccine orders outstanding, at least in the amount needed, to cover the booster shots for the whole population than many epidemiologists think we're going to need. Okay, so we may run into another problem next year if we discover that the booster shot is a necessity. Okay, because it will be again at the back of the line. So those are very big problems, but of course, I'm an economist, so I'm going to talk about the economics, okay? One characteristic of Brazil right now is that the economic team that Bolsonaro put in place display a total incompetence in the implementation. Now, on one hand, that's kind of good, you know, if you want to have malevolent people to be incompetent, but there's also some important reforms that, at least on paper, the economic team favored, that they succeeded in botching. Okay, so it's not even the things I find attractive, they don't work out. Now, however, all this discussion now is completely irrelevant because the economic team has signaled that the main objective of economic policy from now until 2022 is to re-elect Bolsonaro. So the quality of economic policies would deteriorate even further. You should expect right now, first, let me give you a short example. You know, it was discovered in the last few months that the number of lawsuits lost by the government would total $15 billion for 2022. Okay, when I say discovered, because you know the government has a whole apparatus of defense. You know, I am a member of an audit committee. You know, I'm a member of the board and the audit committee of our corporation. And you know, one of the things we always ask is, how are the lawsuits going? You know, you have to kind of follow that, right? The economics said no, it was a surprise. So now they say it's $15 billion. They send a budget, which is total fantasy, where essentially, because they essentially promised they're going to pass a constitutional amendment so that they don't have to pay this $15 billion of lawsuits. They lost at the highest level of the courts, at the Supreme Court. Maybe they'll get that done. Maybe then the Supreme Court will declare you can't make a constitutional amendment that says the government doesn't have to pay. There's a lot of political problem because a lot of that money is owed to the states. So it's not clear that Congress is going to pass a constitutional amendment. But that's the kind of thing that they're basing their budget on. We also have an energy crisis. And of course, the lack of rain is not their fault, but it took a long time to take measures that leads to savings, such as starting some of the marginal thermoelectric plants. And so now they're going to have to do things in a more drastic way, which of course will be more expensive. Of course, they're praying to God, and as you know, they really believe in God. So maybe it will rain. Maybe God would satisfy Bolsonaro's prayer. Okay, finally, let me tell you a real problem we're going to have in the long run. It's not in this horizon, it's a problem in the long run. The government did very little to ensure that poor Brazilians had access to remote learning. So this generation is going to probably end up with less educated than the neighboring generations. And this is in a country where, of course, the level of education is very low and education is very bad. Now, I don't think that it was just incompetence. Part of it is that Bolsonaro's team has been promoting the idea that kids should be primarily educated by their parents. They're trying to change the law so it's no longer compulsory to send kids to school. So I was not surprised that Bolsonaro vetoed laws that had been passed by parliament that provided funds to increase remote access to school children. I think I made it 12 minutes, Fran, and thank you.
You did great. You've both been great. You've both been on time. Santiago, the pressure is on. Can you do this within 12 to 15 minutes? We shall see, but we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you all.
No, thank you, Fran, and thank you to the Rockefeller Center at Harvard for for inviting me. Great to be in a panel with Adriana and with Jose, and very timely panel. I wish it was an ex-post panel on what happened with COVID, but unfortunately it's not. It's an ongoing panel about how the region is suffering from COVID because it's not over. So I'll make a few general remarks about the region first, and then I'll focus on Mexico a little bit more, and then I'll end up with some general remarks again. So there's a lot of heterogeneity in the region. So it is difficult to make across the board statements. If you compare Uruguay with Argentina, you know, they're very different responses and all that. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, but that said, on the whole, if you think of Latin America as a country, this country did less well than most other countries in the world in responding to the crisis. So this is a continent that did not do well. And it did not do well partly for structural reasons. The structural reasons having to do with the fact that they have very dysfunctional labor markets in which, depending on the country, 30, 40, 60, 80% of the labor force is in the informal sector, and it's extremely difficult to provide social protection in those cases. And partly because the responses of the governments were also, on the whole, with exceptions, but on the whole, somewhat inept, as Jose described for the case of Brazil. So structural factors mixed in with short-term responses to generate a situation in which the region did less well than the rest of the world. If and when COVID ends, there's really no good reason to think that things are going to be structurally better. In fact, my bet would be that the long-term scars inherited from COVID, unless real action is taken, will actually worsen the structural problems that the region has. And among them, the synthetic indicator of why the region performs so badly is perhaps productivity growth. If you said, tell me one thing that distinguishes Latin America from other regions of the world, the answer would be, this is a region in which, on the whole, productivity growth over the last 2 decades has been zero. If you compare this with East Asia, if you compare this with Eastern Europe, if you compare this with other countries of the world, you understand why they're doing much better than us, because at the end of the day, they're doing things better. Now, productivity is a very complex issue. Many things come into it, has to do with the quality of education, has to do with the quality of institutions, but it also has to do with the quality of labor markets. And Adriana showed some really interesting numbers about the composition of employment. Adriana showed that in Latin America, between workers that are self-employed or workers that are working in micro firms, in firms that have, say, 2 to 4 workers, I mean, we're really talking tiny firms, you have, on average, 50% of the labor force, but in some cases, much more. In Ecuador, 70%. In Colombia, to take Adriana's country, 6 out of 10 workers work on their own or in a firm that has, on average, 3 workers. So this is antithetical to productivity growth. And this is associated with the fragmented social protection systems that the region has, and is then the explanation for why the response to COVID was so difficult, because structurally they were not ready for it. Let me make a few remarks about Mexico. Mexico was not doing well even before COVID. In fact, Mexico has not been doing well for the last 2 decades. Despite NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and despite a very successful stabilization, productivity growth in Mexico in the last 2 decades has been zero. Actually, if you get a little picky with the numbers, it's been negative. So it hasn't been done well. And then COVID comes in, and the response of the government is actually not the appropriate one. So a few facts about what the response was. Compared to other countries in Latin America, the Mexican response to COVID in terms of additional transfers to protect the poor was the least generous. Other countries might have spent 1%, 2%, 3% of GDP in additional resources channeled, perhaps efficiently, perhaps inefficiently, but still, the intention to help was there. I don't know what Jose thinks. I think the Brazilian response last year was particularly generous, and it protected a lot of people. The Mexican was the least generous protection of all. They also did the least in terms of any programs to support employment, or in fact, any programs for anti-cyclical spending. So GDP in Mexico last year fell 8.5%. It was not growing before. And then we had the biggest drop in GDP since the 1930s. So the fall of 8.5% was really pretty bad. The response on the health front was also among the weakest in the region. Partly because there was very little effort on the part of the government to impose mandates for masks, partly because they were very slow in taking responses, and partly because vaccination has been going slowly. Of all the countries in the world, Mexico occupies along the least 10, the worst 10, in terms of deaths of COVID per capita. This is a country with middle income per capita that on the health front did very badly. So the result is the household expenditure for 2021 is now in. It has been analyzed by a lot of panelists, by a lot of people, researchers in Mexico, and poverty today is higher than what was before. Some of it was unavoidable, but some of it was avoidable. Incredibly, Mexico had a $70 billion line of credit with the IMF, on which it could draw on automatically, that was negotiated before COVID, of which it did not draw $1, despite the fact that we've been paying commissions on that amount for 10 years. So it was a very weak response, and then we're not surprised then that growth collapses, poverty goes up. What are the prospects as we move on and as we look ahead? Almost statistically, inevitably, output will rebound. So output is expected to go up this year by about 6%, but remember the last year it fell 8.5%. So we'll recover some, but not all, of the lost income. And perhaps this recovery will continue sometime into 2022, depending on COVID, partly depending on what happens in the US, but partly depending on whether Delta and the next variant of Delta, Mu or Lambda or whatever comes next, it expands. So you might get at least some additional growth in 2022. My sense is that by 2023, Mexico will go back to its usual mediocrity, which is a growth of 2%, basically supported by population growth and labor force growth and capital accumulation, with very little contribution from productivity, in fact, actually negative productivity growth. So this is not a pretty picture. It is not a pretty picture for the region. It is not a pretty picture for Mexico. As we think about the medium term, we have to think about the long-term scars from COVID. Jose mentioned a few, having to do with education, and some of the data that Adriana showed us supported that hypothesis. I'm concerned about that one, and I'm concerned about another one, which is that the labor markets will become even more dysfunctional after COVID than they were before COVID. The quick indicator of these would be a structural increase in the rate of labor informality. And Adriana showed those numbers to that effect. But it would also be shown in further deformities or distortions, whatever word you prefer, in the size distribution of firms and in the dispersion of productivity of firms, as a very thick left tail of firms that are very small and very unproductive is supported by social protection programs that are trying to help people, and they're doing it in a very inefficient and perverse way. So that the structural factors that are actually not contributing for a vibrant region where productivity growth might actually be exacerbated as a result of COVID, and this might be a long-term scar. Let me try to end with a slightly optimistic note, with a big speculative observation. COVID might be what the debt crisis of the 1980s was. The debt crisis of the 1980s for Latin America was the famous lost decade. And it was terrible in terms of income per capita, poverty, and inequality. But towards the end of that decade, there was finally a consensus that things had to change. And most of the change was reflected in macroeconomic policy. There were major changes in the region in terms of trying to get fiscal balances under control, give autonomy to central banks, shift into flexible exchange rate regimes, a whole bunch of changes that actually allowed the region to have a much better macroeconomic performance after the debt crisis than before. It was a political space created by, sadly, 10 years of waste, which eventually forced politicians and forced society as a whole into a change. I don't know whether COVID might be the same or not. Perhaps it is too early to tell. But the costs are so high today that it might induce people to really take stock and say that more of the same is really not a solution. That to go back to a situation before COVID with dysfunctional labor markets and with dysfunctional institutions is not the way it's going to deliver social inclusive growth. So if we want to observe socially inclusive growth in the future, we need substantive, deep transformations in institutions. And I put special emphasis on labor markets, associated with that tax policy and labor policy and social insurance policy that has to do with what labor market is. That might be the only silver lining associated with what so far is a very, very sad situation. Thank you, Fran, and thank you all to listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Santiago. It was wonderful. Let me start off. I'd like to start a round of questions and a dialogue among the panelists with some very big, broad questions that all your presentations have raised for me. And then we can get down into the weeds later. So I want to sort of come back to Santiago's last point at the end. But the first thing I want to sort of that I picked up across your presentations is Latin America everywhere in Latin America is hit very hard by COVID. Of course, the whole world has been, but Latin America more so. Latin America is the shrinkage of the Latin American economies, the rise of poverty, the rise of informality, the loss of educational access. And this has all been a disaster, like the Depression. The thing that's a little weird, and we have two candidate explanations. One are the structural foundations. We have a lot of informality to begin with. We have low levels of quality education. This isn't East Asia. So there's definitely structural factors. Then there's also the government responses. And the government responses across the region have been different, but none of them seem to have been successful. We have somewhere between stupidity and evil. We have, the Bolsonaro government inherits a wonderful healthcare system and manages to devastate it, manages to botch the vaccine program, to put out false information about it, to shut down the research institutes that denied the funding to the research institutes that could have produced domestic vaccines. I mean, you can't imagine a worse response to public health crisis. But when you look at some other countries, they responded very seriously and very quickly. Peru, Argentina, these countries started with lockdowns very quickly. They weren't denying what was happening. Peru has been hit very hard by this pandemic. So we have social protection in Brazil, thanks to the opposition benches of Congress. But in Mexico, we have a leftist president who doesn't draw a dime from a line of credit that could have been used. So I don't understand the government responses. I don't understand why nothing seems to have worked. And so I would love to hear all of you sort of comment about why you think Latin America has got such a hard road back. And this brings me to Santiago's point about this possibly being like the debt crisis and that some good will come out of this. And I first got very happy when he said he was going to give us a note of optimism. And so I was listening intently, but I became a bit discouraged that actually it seems a lot easier to fix spending too much on pensions and selling a few steel mills and passing a law of fiscal responsibility. It seemed like macroeconomic control was kind of maybe politically difficult, but not that hard to achieve. But how do we reform educational systems and labor markets to allow for productivity in the region and to allow for productivity growth? Is that going to be as easy as everyone gets exhausted, like at the end of an inflationary episode and at the end of a crisis? So that's sort of my question looking ahead. I'm also want to invite Jose to say a little bit more about some of the cutting edge issues that he had to go over too quickly because of the draconian time limits of your moderator. You were talking about climate, you were talking about energy, and I also am particularly worried about education. I'm also particularly worried about a generation of students who in 2 years are going to have lost so much and become so discouraged, they're going to drop out of school. And what is Latin America's future going to be without its young people? Just when it seemed like we were getting to the point where we're recognizing that we had sort of achieved, we had expanded access to secondary education. Now we needed to worry about quality. And now we can't even guarantee kids are going to stay in school. So those are my questions to start off with. And we can go in the whatever order you want, but if in the absence of a suggestion, I'd say in the same order we went in the presentations. Adriana, if you're ready, you could start. And then while you're talking, we will look at the question and answer function, and we will start to pull together some questions from that. Steve will take the next round, but for now, you have my questions to start.
Okay, so in general, we want to talk about the responses of governments, and I could talk then about the case of Colombia and related to what Santiago was saying, the weakness of the social protection systems, where we have a high informality rate, which are individuals which are just not covered by the social security. Let's say they could be covered by social assistance, for example, but not by the social security, the contributive system. So the countries just needed to do something really quick for 60% of the population, and for the poor in the case of Colombia, for 40% of the people. So this is really hard to do it, and it's in such a fast way. As I told you, like the increase in the number of people that the government reached almost doubled, but it doubled not maybe in the amount that the population needed in order to not go into such conditions of food insecurity, as I showed in the presentation, for example. But this is just on the side of individuals, and we're not thinking on what was the policies in terms of moving the economy and being and continuing being productive and not having such a strong shock in the economy. It's also something that was also difficult to do, and that's the trade-off between the lockdowns and the economic recovery. Let's say Colombia had really very long lockdowns. I think it's one of the longest lockdowns that we had in the region, and the vaccination was not as fast as we would expect. It has been going really, really fast after June, but we had 3 peaks of really bad situations in terms of contagious and mortality. So an additional point that we had in Colombia was that after all the transfers were given by the government, they had this fiscal deficit, as I was mentioning, and the government needed to do a fiscal reform to get the money to finance these and to finance these programs until the end of 2022, as they were expecting, and these created social protests. So the social protest ended up being many people in the streets, and the 3rd peak of contagion appeared in that moment. So I think that's like the overview of what happened here and what happened with the policies and with the situations in terms of what the population did. But it's really difficult to understand the trade-off between lockdown and economy. What would have been better to do? And regarding the education, it's really sad that we are seeing already, and there's data already of of knowing if students are learning less. And we have, for example, the high school test scores that students are getting are reducing in terms of the margin of their, if that's measuring value added, they are reducing the quality of education that they are receiving or getting, demanding or offering. It's a combination of both. And we are also seeing a gap in urban rural areas. So that's really difficult with countries with such high inequalities. As I was saying in the presentation, and as you were mentioning initially, why was this region so badly affected? And I think one of the big issues is that the high levels of inequality might be a big, let's say, key point to understand why we were so badly hit by the pandemic. Okay, and I give the floor maybe to Santiago or Jose.
Thanks. No, perfect. So, Jose.
Thank you, Fran. Let me start by saying two things that I liked very much, and I agree with what Santiago said. The first has to do with productivity. Productivity, you know, and again, I'm going to use the experience of Brazil, but seems to be all Latin America. That's the same thing. Productive growth in Brazil Brazil has been mediocre all through since the 80s. Okay, at some point, a Brazilian worker produced a third of an American worker, and now we're down to the low 20s. So that's the story, you know. So haven't been able to even to follow the frontier. Now, there are many reasons for that, but if you look at the data, if you just do the usual decomposition that economists do, if you look, for instance, at the education of the labor force, even though it didn't improve a lot, it did not contribute negatively to the productivity changes. The same thing about investment. Brazil invests very little, but again, it didn't contribute very much or it didn't contribute even positively to this decline. It didn't contribute even to the decline. The big thing is what we call total factor productivity. Everything else. How do we do things? How do we use labor and capital to produce stuff? And there we keep losing, and I like Santiago's view on this, but in Brazil, that's the problem. That's where we keep losing. We're doing things worse than we're doing in 1980s, which is an incredible thing. And if you want looking for culprit, I completely agree with Santiago. It's coming from the large number of small and even increasing number of small and very inefficient firms. But there are two culprits. I agree the security system play a role, but also there is a tax system. Tax system in Brazil really favors small and inefficient firms over larger because the tax treatment is completely different. So that's one point that I want to talk, and I really agree with Santiago. The second, he asked me about what I thought about the program. In fact, because the opposition parties, Brazil ended up with the number is pretty large of percentage of GDP that we spent. However, it was really badly done. It was really badly focused. So one of the things that I think Santiago did not mention, but I'm sure he agrees, that happened after the crisis of the 1980s, is that we decided, many Latin American countries decided, that we needed to start focusing the social programs and make them more reach the people that really need it. And like Mexico, Brazil built a very good infrastructure for that. That infrastructure depends on local mayors, and it's capable of putting the amount of money into the hands of the most needed. And that's the example of Bolsa Familia, which is a very small program, 0.5% of GDP, but it really did a lot to alleviate the worst poverty. Now, of course, because that's done at the mayoral level, and Bolsonaro wanted the credit, even though he had opposed it in Congress, he decided to do it the federal way. They didn't use any of the information. So everybody got a check. You know, now we know that thousands of people in the military got a check, thousands of civil servants got a check. So it's really like, again, this incompetence. And I want to finish by saying that I think that Latin America has really a problem of competence with administration, which is not trivial. Okay, I give my favorite example in Brazil is that we the Brazilian government collects something between 1/3 and 40% of GDP, depends how you count, okay? But it's incapable of giving basic sewage to more than 40% of the population. That's really an unbelievable number. You look at any country, given per capita income in Brazil and the share of income that's collected by the government, any other country, including many Latin American countries, could deliver a larger fraction of the population with sewage. Colombia, by the way, is one example, does much better than Brazil. But the Brazilian government seems to be incapable of doing that. We've been, spending a lot of money on sewage, but nothing gets done. So after this long introduction, let me do a short answer to Frank. Look, I think the climate question really concentrates on the Amazon. That's, I think, the most urgent one, the actions of the government in the Amazon. So Bolsonaro has a base, counts as part of his base, two populations which are involved in the destruction of the Amazon. One are the miners, and he basically made it illegal for the services that try to control mining to do any punishment. Maybe same thing was true about people that extract wood. The wood extraction is becoming less and less important because people elsewhere want the wood to be well certified. So that's it. But the third one are with what I call land speculation. Land speculation in the Amazon is done in the following way. You go, you destroy the forest, you put 3 heads of cattle, okay? Then you wait to get a penalty. It's very important to be penalized because now you have a receipt. Penalties are very small, you pay your receipt. At that time, the clock starts ticking. And theoretically in 10 years, but much sooner because Parliament passes amnesty every few years, including one that Bolsonaro is trying to pass right now. In the next amnesty, the land is yours. Now, this land tends to be very unproductive. It's a whole speculative market, so you can sell it to somebody else who not ready to go through the whole process. And that process, Bolsonaro is really encouraging. So this is a real problem for Brazil. It's not a new problem, but has existed before. But starting in the Lula government, especially because of Marina Silva, the system got under control. It's not difficult to control. Nowadays, satellites can tell you what everyone is doing, what each one is doing outdoors. It's very easy to, and they were catching people and penalizing. They'll come in and destroy the mining equipment. So, or destroy the equipment people were using to deforest in order to steal the land. But that Bolsonaro has told the people, that the police people, the people who are in charge of policing, that they cannot do. I would perhaps keep energy. I think energy is a big problem for Brazil. It's related to climate. It's not just the fault of Brazil, but Brazil is probably contributing to it. But the problem of energy is very serious because we have a very good, from a climate point of view, system, which is mostly hydroelectric. Brazil is one of, it's not Norway, but it's one of the most hydroelectric countries in the world in terms of percentage. But that's something that, of course, is subject to climate. You have to have thermoelectrics to kind of pick up when climate gets bad. The consequences of climate are bad, but you have to manage that efficiently, and we haven't done it. The third is education that you raised. Yeah, education in Brazil is a big problem. Again, it's part of this incompetence of government. One of the things which is shocking in Brazil is this. There are areas of Brazil, like Ceará, which is, for those of you who know, it's a relatively poor state. It's one of the poorest states in Brazil. But that's great in education. Schools in Ceará, you control for anything, they do better than the rest of the schools in Brazil. So the question that many of us have is that why don't educators go to Ceará, find out what those guys are doing and copying it? By the way, that's an American problem too. We have a lot of education, a lot of systems of education perform very badly when compared with others that do much better in circumstances which are actually worse. So we have a bad education system, but during Bolsonaro's government, there's this whole promotion that's saying schools are bad for kids. They're bad for kids because they make them into communists or sexual deviants, whatever they think they do. And of course, the ministers of education have been very incompetent. One of them is now in Washington. You know, the guy cannot spell, but he was Minister of Education. Cannot use a spell checker, which is even worse. So, but that's what Brazil is. And I think Bolsonaro vetoed, as I said, the funds that had been voted for for helping remote access. And I do think that in a system of education that is already very non-functional, the shock of the Bolsonaro government is going to last a long time.
Well, I'm proud to say that one of our students, Tabata Amaral, got one of those ministers of education at least fired. So I'll pass this over. Thank you all. Steve.
Okay, I have collected several questions that I'll throw out to the group, and you guys, as always, can pick and choose the ones that you want to answer. I guess 3 general questions and 2 country-specific questions. You know who the recipients of those are. The first general question comes from June Ehrlich, and she asked 2 about taking for granted the idea that policy is and the policy emphases are going to change post-pandemic. And she asks about 2 areas. One, and this gets to a little bit of what Santiago finished with. To what extent are we going to see a rethinking of the role and the rights of informal workers post-pandemic? And secondly, do we think we'll see a drop in the significance of the importance of the tourism industry in many Latin American economies? Another general question, we got a question about what, or a participant asked for some policy recommendations going forward. What sorts of general policies are most important for sort of digging economies out? And also where sort of interesting ideas for policy change are coming from, think tanks, universities, where are we seeing interesting policy thinking in Latin America today? The third general question, very briefly, comes from me, which is, Fran pointed to the incredible variation in response to the public health problem, the COVID problem. And obviously we heard about Brazil and Mexico, which are in one tail. Did a good COVID response or a decent policy response, choose your case, did that have any economic impact at all? I mean, was there an economic benefit to responding relatively well on the public health front? Thinking about Peru, one could conclude that maybe not. It's very, very depressing. Okay, the 2 country-specific questions. First for Jose on Brazil, actually 2 questions. One is why, given how awful Bolsonaro's been, even for practitioners of free market economic policies, why have not the representatives, why have not center-right politicians pushed for impeachment? Why have more market-oriented political representatives not pushed to impeach Bolsonaro? And the second question from the same participant was, how is the economic scenario today different from, say, 2016 when Jim was impeached? Finally, for Mexico, for Santiago, is the Mexican government, not necessarily AMLO himself, but the current Mexican government at all interested, in your view, development of more effective or more efficient social policies in the future? And this is a government supposedly of the left, really botched, at least according to many people on the left, the initial response to the crisis. Does this government have any sort of interesting vision for welfare state expansion at all? You guys should choose to answer the ones you want. Thanks.
Which order should we?
Same order. Same order.
Sorry?
sorry, can you hear
I'm,
me?
I'm sorry,
Sure,
guys. You skipped Santiago last time.
I skipped Santiago. Santiago should start.
Okay, then
Let's
that sounds fair.
Well, what I wanted to do, thank you, was to take a little bit the question that Fran asked, and I'll use that as a vehicle to also maybe touch on some of the questions that Stephen just read. But before I do that, let me agree 100% with Jose on his observation about tax policy and small firms. And I would give here Brazil the silver medal. The gold medal is for Peru. If you look at I mean, they're terrible everywhere, but Peru is like unbelievable, unbelievable. Yeah, that said, Brazil is a close second. And yes, all these tax regimes are really part of the productivity problem, and they need to be put on the table. But let me turn quickly to Fran's sort of observation, connecting the sort of early 1990s with the moment that we're today, and whether potentially this could lead to some serious substantive changes. And why is it not as easy? And so this is my view. I think the fundamental difference, Fran, is that in the early 1990s, there was an intellectual consensus as to what needed to be done. You could argue about the edges of that consensus, but the broad direction of, better fiscal balances, better monetary policy, independent central banks, flexible exchange, the broad direction, low inflation. You could quibble the details, but everybody knew where you went. I don't see that consensus here today. I don't see it in academia. I don't see it in multilateral development banks. I don't see it in think tanks in general. My reading today, I might be wrong, my reading is that we're in a context in which it's kind of a flavor of the day policy. If it's Monday, you think that education is very, very important. If it's Tuesday, you put the emphasis on infrastructure. If it's Wednesday, you think that universal basic income is really the way to go. Thursday, you have to talk about the digital economy and how that's going to come out. I'm being a bit facetious. I'm trying to point out that there's no, in my reading, no intellectual consensus. If you took 5 economists and you gave them a magic wand and you said, all right, here's the magic wand, here is what you need to do, my guess would be that they would do 5 different things. 30 years ago, they probably would have done a little bit more the same. So it's going to be more difficult because we've yet to chart a way in which there's intellectual consensus among the policy community, among multilaterals, among all participants. That said, it's going to be more difficult because the political dynamics of the region are much more complex. There was no social media in the early 1990s. Political participation and the methods of political participation, the way information flowed and the way societal consensus were formed. The mechanisms for forming societal consensus have changed. And we don't understand exactly how to use them. Governments are trying to struggle and they try to control part of the social media sphere, but then other than many competitors, and it's extremely difficult in a cacophony, literally a cacophony, to try to bring together that. So maybe it's going to be much complex. Let me touch a little bit on where I think would go, and I'll give you my own flavor of the day. My flavor of the day is that, look, we've got to make a real difference between what we want for growth and what we want for socially inclusive growth, and they're not the same. If you want growth, it may be enough if you get a lot of capital investment and you get some, infrastructure, or you promote direct foreign investment, or you get a positive terms of trade shock, something like that, an investment boom might deliver you some growth. Social inclusive growth is much more difficult because you need efficient mechanisms to share the gains from growth. And Latin America doesn't have them today. Jose touched upon conditional cash transfer programs. And as you mentioned, I was involved in the design of the Mexican conditional cash transfer programs. These are not the right answer for social inclusive growth. In my view, there's been a big misunderstanding about the role of these programs. You cannot have socially inclusive growth with dysfunctional labor markets. And that is more associated with bigger issues associated with the design of social protection, the design of labor laws, the design of unemployment insurance, pensions, access to health, the design of taxes for firms, and the dual systems of social insurance that we have created, in which some workers have access to contributory programs and some other workers have access to a myriad of completely disconnected. In a project in which Adriana and I have been involved with UNDP, we've been studying the macroeconomic incentives associated with this. And what you find is that it is difficult to think of more perverse incentives in terms of shifting resources into the left tail of opportunity distribution and making difficult for workers to transit from poverty into non-poverty and informality into non-informality. And that brings me to one last point, and I'll stop here. The question, I forgot the name, sorry, about the person who's speaking about whether there's going to be a rethink of the rights of informal workers. An observation here would be, sorry?
It's June, never forget her name.
Oh,
June
sorry.
Ellen.
Sorry, June, I forgot. But thank you for your question. So in answer to your question, we tend to think of formal and informal workers in the region, but the data shows that workers transit a lot between formal and informal status. Some countries have very good data for that. Brazil has very good data on panel data of individual workers. So does Mexico. Many countries have now developed data that allows you to follow the trajectories of workers, and sometimes they're informality and there's sometimes in informality, the same person with the same human capital. So what this basically says is that even though labor markets are segmented, they're not separated. There's a lot of going back and forth. And therefore you need to think about rights in a more universal sense, not associated with a particular occupation that you have at any one point in time, but in a more universal sense. Brazil is actually an excellent example in terms of health. It's the only country in Latin America that has a unified health system in which whether you're formal or informal has no bearing on your access to health. But Brazil is an exemption. In Colombia, in Mexico, where I'm from, your rights to health, depending on whether a particular point in time you have this occupation or you have that occupation. So looking forward and more effective social policy, I think we have to think about universality, and this has large implications for tax design, and this has large implications for abandoning the Bismarckian notion of social insurance that is still very much embedded in our countries and that is completely old-fashioned and doesn't serve very well. That, in my view, and this is my flavor of the day, is what we need to do if we want socially inclusive growth. But again, Fran, I think the intellectual consensuses are not there.
Is not there yet. Well, thank you. And again, my apologies for just having lost track of who had answered in the first round. And so you've been heroic, Santiago, in answering questions from both rounds. We're going to need to close in a few minutes because people at this university have classes at 1:30. But I want to give a few minutes each then to Jose and to Adriana to answer the questions that Steve put before we need to close. And so whichever of you wants to go first, just go ahead. And then the other.
Please go ahead. But you have a question on Brazil and the general one, and I'll finish. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say go ahead, Adriana, but I was on mute, so you beat me to it. Okay, sorry. So you want to go first? Okay. So I think Santiago covered a lot of the answers. I want to say something. I think I'm just, in some sense, repeating what he said, but with a different emphasis, which is our problem in Brazil. Of course, informality is a problem, but informality for me is a measurement thing. You measure the number of people who are informal, and as Santiago says, it's not the same person all the time. You know, so that's like a symptom. Informality is a symptom. I think the major question, there are some aspects, Santiago said, that the social security system that kind of encourages certain type of informality because the existence of these dual programs and so on. I am very favorable to universal health system, but in fact, you know, it does, you know, so on that is extremely good, but it does have some incentive effects with respect to that. But I think we have to act at the level of the firm. Something I've been saying, I'm afraid to say because it's going to date me for over 25 to 30 years in Brazil, is a sentence that says, the problem is not to help the informal food vendor. The problem is to make the informal food vendor work, has a job in an efficient supermarket. That's the problem of Brazil. And I think that's a problem of in many other places in Latin America, is that these guys, the number of jobs that are, because of the way that often the tax system, the licensing system, et cetera, is such that, you know, the informal food vendor, even though he's much less efficient than as a worker at a supermarket, he ends up doing the first activity because it's very expensive to keep him as a worker in the supermarket. So let me finish with a little bit also of optimism, so you don't end with this. It's true that there was all this macro reforms that happened in the 90s and in the 80s and 90s, and now we're talking about I'm talking about Brazil specifically. But it also did, for the first time, we started debating the question of education. I just wrote an article describing the work of Carlos Langoni, who's a very knowledgeable education economist, whose work was completely ignored in Brazil, completely ignored, even though technically that work was at the frontier by US standards, you know. So that's the, people didn't want to talk about this, about education. We talk about education. Santiago and others constructed a system of conditional cash transfer, which of course is not a solution for all those who inclusion was super important. So I think some good things came out of that. And I think that there was a broader program than just a macro program. And I think we could try that again, a broader program with many things. Thank you.
Great. Adriana.
I think I just have two very quick things to say, in addition to what has been said. So first, the question about policy changes post-pandemic. I think that I would choose from all of those the labor markets, because are the ones that have changed the most. Like maybe work would never be as it was the same before, like always in presence. So we have to adapt all the regulation to make a regulation to hybrid schemes of labor markets. That's something I think it should change. And given that we're going to enter into those topics, and I think Santiago would agree in this sense, to make formality become more attractive in terms that the benefits that people are receiving in formal jobs would be valued in the same way as the costs are being taxed, and or are being like paid by the employers or employees. That's one of the points, and the other point is the discussion. I think we need to raise again the discussion about universal basic income in the region, because like social assistance had to do a very big effort at this time to reshuffle everything and to give a basic income, let's say, in different ways to population, and try to target them and to find them out who were the ones who need it and don't need it. So, but to do that, I think that the government need to have all individuals to file income just to get subsidies or to receive or to pay taxes. But that's something that I think we need to move forward, and it would be ideal to have it. I think those are the 2 points in addition to what was said.
Perfect. Well, there may not be a consensus like the Washington consensus of 1990, but we seem to have a consensus on this panel. So if Latin America would listen to all of you, maybe we'll start to have a path toward recovery, assuming we get the public health situation under control. And that is a global problem. But we can't have more years of 8% shrinkages of the economies of Latin America. So let's all hope for the best and work to make the most of it. We shouldn't let this crisis go to waste. So thank you all very, very much. And join us next week when I should have the panel here. Next week is, Steve, is next week the crisis of democracy? Yes, Gabby has just put this in the chat. So it's going to be another all-star panel next week. So join us again next Tuesday. And now everyone at Harvard has got 3 minutes to get to classes. Thank you so much. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye, Adriana. Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
Jorge.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.